This is Jared from Commit Quality. In today's video, we're going to go over some experimental features for test retries, which were added to Cypress a couple of weeks ago. So before we actually get involved in any of this, let's make sure you're in your package.json and you've updated Cypress to the latest version. In my case, it's 13.5.1. So make sure you've updated and then just do npm I for npm install, and all looks good. Let's clear that down. So let's have a quick discussion about what I'm talking about. So Cypress has retryability built in. We've seen it in my previous videos, and you probably already have it built into your config with your tests. However, now Cypress have introduced this experimental flake detection feature. And let's just have a quick chat about what they've added, and then we'll show some examples of them. So normally then your test retries that you have without any of this experimental stuff built in would simply stop on your first passing attempt, and then the final test result of any flaky test is always going to be marked as passing. That's regardless of how many prior attempts have failed. So with this new experimental settings, basically for retries, it gives you more control over the retry process, and if you want a test to fail or how many times a flaky one should pass until you mark it as pass or failure. So there's two different kind of strategies added in. One, which is the detect, flake, and pass on threshold, which is basically giving failing tests a chance to still pass, but it'll still detect that flakiness for you. Like it says here, that's kind of like the current implementation of retries you have, but it's given us a bit more flexibility with what we want to do, and we'll touch on that in a second. And then the next one is detect, flake, but always fail. And you could probably guess it from the name of this, but it'll retry your tests and still mark them flaky tests as failures, even if they've passed, because they were flaky at some point. What's really good about this one is if you actually want to ensure that your flaky tests are treated as the same urgency of failing tests, of things you want to make sure that you fixed up, and if you want to have that consistent non-flaky test back, this is a really good way to kind of highlight those ones for you. And the other thing I just want to touch on before we jump into the code is it's worth noting these experimental retry features can only be set currently at a global level, meaning it has to be done from inside your Cypress config file, and it can't be done like with retries where you can set different values for retries per test. You can't do that at this point in time. You can only do it from this global level. Cypress actually mentioned that somewhere in here as well. There we are. So experimental retries can only be configured at the global level and not per individual test, whereas non-experimental retries can be configured per test. Perfect. And it's good I've gone to this because there's also mentioned, which I probably would have forgot to mention, is when you're setting for retries, you can set different values. When you're using the experimental ones, you just set a true or false, and then I'll take the property values we set up in our config, which I'll go through in a second. So let's jump right into this. At the moment, I'm just going to show you what I've got. I've got an example file, which is very basic. It's going to go to commit quality. I'm going to do a side.pause because this is where I'm going to actually pause and enter details into the text box to make it fail or pass. And then we've got this assertion to make sure that the filter text box has a value of subscribe. So if we go to commit quality, you'll see here we're going to be looking at this text box here to see if it has a value of subscribe or not. By default, it's going to fail because, of course, there is no value set in there at the moment. Awesome. So let's get into the actual config itself. So what we need to do inside here, we need to actually set the properties we want. So let's say retries. And first of all, we've got to say what the experimental strategy is going to be. So in our case, we'll start with detect, flake, and pass on threshold. And we're going to set the experimental options here, which is what we're going to do for both strategies. And the first one in this case is going to be max retry. So how many times do you want to retry things? So I'm just going to set it as 3. So that means it could possibly be a maximum of 4 times the test is running. The first one where it fails, and then the 3 where it tries to retry. And then the second option we want to pass through is pass is required. And this is a really interesting one. So I'm going to set it as number 1 at the moment. So what this means is if a test passes 1 time, it's going to stop the retries. It's not going to go to the next one, and the test will be marked as a success. However, we are going to go into the option. What happens when I say max pass is required at 3? That means if this doesn't pass 3 times, because we've only got a retry of 3 times, if this fails on the first retry, it's not going to rerun it anymore. It's going to mark the test as failing. And the reason is because, of course, this number this number needs to be met, and if it fails on the first retry, the max you'd only ever get is 2 in this case. So Cypress have been smart and said, well, I can't hit the 3 retries, so we might as well fail it early. So let's stick this to 1 for now, just to be on the safe side. And of course, what we just mentioned in the actual documentation is we need to say open mode, we'll set it to true, and we've got to do run mode as well. And how we'll do it as true. We're not going to use run mode in this case. I'll use Cypress open for each of them. Of course, don't know why I added a comma there, so let's say a colon there. Perfect. So all that looks good. So what we should be able to do now is run our test, and we say in that we've got this detect flake and pass on threshold. It can be a maximum of 3 retries, but we only require 1 of those retries to pass, and we can cancel the loop. So I'm going to say npx Cypress open. So basically what I want to do is go to end-to-end testing, and I'll say electron. So up the spec, we only have 1 test. So what we should see is this should pause here. Perfect. So in this first case, I'm just going to let it run through because there's no subscribe inside the text box. What it should mean is this one will fail. Of course, we're going to wait for the assertion. There we are. That one failed. So attempt 1 failed. Now I'm going to let it fail again. So this is the first retry, and we should have 3. So there we are. It's gone. Attempt 2 has failed. Now we're on attempt 3. Remember, we'd have 4 attempts altogether because the first one wasn't a retry. Now what I want to do is I'm actually going to enter subscribe into here, and what we should see is when I click play now, this test will pass, but it's not going to run the last retry because in our config we said we only require 1 of these retries to pass. So let's give that a go, hit resume, and here you are. It succeeded on attempt 3 and the test finished completely. And just to prove that's correct as well, let's rerun it again. I'm just going to click play through all of these. And what we should see is 3 retries with 4 attempts, and they all failed. There we are, 4 attempts, all marked as failed, because of course we didn't add anything into there. Now then, let's go back and change this pass is required to 3. So we'll fail the first test, so it goes into this flaky behavior. And now then, if I was to click play here, which I will, we're going to see it fails immediately after this because Cypress knows we have to have 3 retry attempts to pass, and the first one failed, so we could never hit that number. So if I rerun the test now, let's make the first one fail. Now we'll put subscribe. Let's copy that. First one passed. Fantastic. Let's go to the second one. That one passed. Now, if I made this last one fail, then of course it's going to mark it as a failure, but I'm not going to do that because we've already showed that example. Now, if I click resume, there we are. All 3 passed and the test has been marked as passed. It's definitely something really cool with Cypress to have these little kind of configuration options that can really help you detect those flaky failures, and you've got complete control of when you want them to fail or when you want them to pass. So with that cleared down, then let's go on to the next one, and we'll say, in this case, it's going to be detect flake but always fail, and there's just one property we want to change. So max retries can still be added, but in this case now we want to say instead of passes required, stop if any passed, and this won't be a boolean, this won't be a number, it's going to be a boolean instead. So I'm going to set this to true first of all, and you can probably already guess what this is going to do. It's basically going to say that if any of the retries pass, then stop at that given time. So it gives you a bit of a faster feedback loop. So instead of running for 3 times, it'll say, okay, 1 passed, doesn't matter. Let's exit out now then and mark the test as a failure, and we know it's flaky. Let's say npx Cypress open. Let's go to electron. Let's go into the actual test itself. So of course we've set the max retries to 3, so we should see 4 attempts if they were all to fail. Let's make the first one fail. So I'll attempt to now. We'll make the second fail just so you can see the max retry still works on it. But now on number 3 then, I'm actually going to make it pass. But what you're going to notice is because I set this stop if any pass to true, when it passes, it's not going to run the last attempt, which would be attempt 4. It's just going to stop here, say it's passed, but up here, we'll see this actually be marked as a failure. So there we are. Even though this attempt passed, we've got a big number 1 next to the failing X here to say that it's a flaky test and we of course want to fail in that case. Now let's just change this to false just to prove what I was talking about here. So you get max retries. Let's let the first one fail. Now if I make this second one pass, it's still going to run through. So attempt 2, there we are. It said passed, but because we've got that stop if any have passed or false, it's going to keep running them through. So I'll fail this one. I'll tell you what, even on the last one, we'll make it pass because we still expect, there we are, the big red X with number 1. Even though we had 2 attempts that passed, it's obviously flaky because only 2 out of 4 actually succeeded. And that's really it. Definitely worth having a play around with this. Definitely worth using these experimental features in your test packs because it can actually speed up your testing, especially if you're waiting for retries to always happen, or if you want to treat your flakiness as failures, then this is obviously going to speed up everything inside your test framework. As always, if you do have any questions or comments, please drop them down below. A like and subscribe is appreciated. I've also enabled super thanks, so if you do want to contribute to the videos, you can add that, and it's always much appreciated. As always, thank you for watching. Have a good day.